now move to the motion before the House this evening, which is, this House believes the country would be better served if farmers focused on profits rather than public goods. I now look to the first speaker, NFU Deputy President Guy Smith, to open the case for the proposition.
Thank you, Mr. President, my lords, ladies and gentlemen. Happy New Year, 2019. What could possibly go wrong? You humble a simple Essex peasant by allowing him to propose this motion this evening. It's an important motion, an important time. This country has to decide going forward where its place will be in the world. And as a consequence of that, it will need to decide from where, home or abroad, it will be fed. And I would remind you that a nation that cannot feed itself is not a proper nation. It is a parasite state. Myself and my seconder, Sarah, we come at this primarily as people that run farm businesses back home, although we wear other hats. So back home in northeast Essex, I do a number of things. I produce renewable energy. I run farm tourist attractions. I do a lot of conservation. But in my essence, what defines me as a farmer is I produce food. And what should define the Oxford Farming Conference should be food production. God help us from the day when the rebranding experts tell us it should be relabelled the Oxford Ecosystem Service Providers Conference. Now, like many farmers, I passionately believe that food production, supply of affordable, wholesome food, homegrown, is a public good. Unfortunately, that is not the official line. As we heard from the Secretary of State today, and as we know from Treasury economists, that food and food production is seen as a market good, not as a public good. So when we read the motion farmer, we must think of food and food production as a market good, not a public good. And therefore, our argument is that as a market good, if you do not show profit as a food producer, then you are going nowhere. You will wither, you will die, and British agriculture will diminish, and we as a nation will have to be fed from other shores. Now, we are not diminishing public goods. Clean air, clean water, good soils, a rich biodiverse landscape, all legitimate public goals. And I would argue, in my humble way, for fear of disappearing up my fundament, that I do a pretty good job. My dear wife, who sits here, rather worryingly on the other side, she has with her a little list of all the birds seen on my farm in 2018. Darling, would you like to? Darling, please, you know it's so much longer than that, please. "96 species, Mr. Lancaster, 96 species. Unfortunately, only 19 of them, according to the RSPB, are farmland birds. I'm never going to get paid for 3/4 of them as public goods. I also monitor the quality of the water on my farm. And I'll tell you something, I am 5-10 times cleaner than the water treatment works that neighbours me. I've done the tests. But I'm not complacent. I want to do better. I want to deliver cleaner water, cleaner air, better soils. And I think it's in my grasp. Mr. Gove, and I'm wary of agreeing with him, but he was right to herald this fourth agricultural revolution. We live in exciting times. When you get in a tractor nowadays, and I presume we've got some tractor drivers amongst us, not just Chelsea tractor drivers. When you get in a tractor driver nowadays, you don't so much drive it, you program it. Telemetry, GPS positioning, robotics, remote sensing, camera technology, controlled traffic, all exciting new technology that can transform the way we farm. We can lower our carbon footprint with this technology. We can meet those public goods. We can produce from smaller areas of land and have more for conservation. But here's the thing, Mr. Gove. You don't get this stuff by writing letters to Santa. You have to be able to afford it. And that's why we come back to profitable farm businesses. If farms aren't profitable, they will not be able to afford to invest in this exciting future. You will not be able to go green if your business is in the red. Profit is not a dirty word in my vocabulary. It is a watchword. It is the basis of my business. It's where I start from. Without profit, my business is going nowhere. And that's why we are arguing tonight that first and foremost, farmers must focus on profit. Profitable farm businesses should be the root of the largest part of the British economy, food and drink. They are the lifeblood of rural communities. As one neat, small and key example of that, last year, we may remember that when the beast from the east took hold, it ground Britain to a halt. And the people that kept the rural roads clear were the farmers, with their tools of food production, their tractors and their diggers. They kept those routes open. They allowed the vital services through. They allowed the food, the nurses, the doctors. It was profitable farm businesses that had that fleet on standby to keep rural communities alive. So we cannot say enough for the importance of profitability. So I think there's some messages to go out tonight from this august place. Firstly, farmers mustn't always blame someone else for lack of profitability. We have an individual responsibility to face the future. The technology of the past will not meet the challenges of tomorrow. We need to make this investment in kit and in ourselves. We need to be better trained, more skilled, better managers. We must take that on ourselves. But there's some messages out there for policymakers. Firstly, farmers cannot go on losing more and more of the food pound. We have lost 20 to 30% in the last 30 to 40 years. This cannot go on. The stranglehold of a few businesses on the food chain in this country is wringing the guts out of our industry. We are, many of us, living on depreciation. We must return some of that profit back to the farm gate so we can invest going forward. And there's things politicians can do. They can embolden the grocery code adjudicator. They can put statutory codes into place to give us more bargaining power. But, Mr. Gove, we've heard your words, but we will judge you by your actions. The environmental lobby need to realise that if we simply achieve public goods by diminishing British agriculture, rewilding vast tracts of our farmland, to make up the shortfall, we will simply import food from other parts of the world where environmental standards are probably worse, and the net effect on the planet will be worse. That must be acknowledged. We are proud of our standards in the UK, rightly so. And myself and Sarah are not suggesting bypassing those high standards for a quick buck. We should support them. But they are high costs with a high standard structure. And we cannot compete against lower costs from a low regulatory structure. British arable farmers, with their well-hedged patchwork landscape, will never compete and make a profit if they're one-to-one, toe-to-toe, against American farmers on a genetically modified prairie. British beef farmers will never go toe-to-toe, one-to-one, if they pick up the bargain basement price of a Sao Paulo beef lot where they use growth hormones all the time. And finally, I would be wary of having farmers chasing too many schemes. And I'll give you one sentence, one last sentence, that encapsulates why I'm wary of that. It's a cry that went up in many farm businesses this time last year as farmers pulled their hair out, poring over maps, trying to fill in their BPS forms. And that one sentence was, "What the fudge have the RPA done with my hedges this time?" Ladies and gentlemen, I commend this motion to this House. Thank you.
The honourable guests for their speech. I now look to Director General of the National Trust, Hilary McGrady, to open the case for the opposition.
Thank you, President, ladies, lords, ladies and gentlemen. I would just like to start with talking about what we mean by public goods. Public goods is such a, it's a bit of a term that we're using at the moment, but what we mean by public goods is the very essence of the things that make your life possible. I'm talking about the air that we breathe, the water that you drink, the soil that you grow your crops in. These are the things that are the essence of a good quality of life for you, but more importantly for your children and for your children's children. You're messing, or potentially messing, with the future, with generations that are ahead of us. And I want you to think, as part of this motion, are we seriously thinking that profit is more important than those critical elements of what we deem to be the essence of our life? And I think not. I want you to think about the balance of why public goods must take precedence over short-termism, over the profit that lines your pockets and our pockets, but not our future generations. Guy makes lots and lots of good points, many of which I agree with. And actually, I agree that profit is important. Of course it is. I'm Director General of one of the biggest charities, not only in the UK and in Europe, conservation charity. And at our core, we want to protect the environment. Of course we do, but I'm also very mindful of financial sustainability. It's just as important to me as an organisation as it is to you. But I do not believe that one should be at the compromise of the other. It would be entirely wrong for that to be the case. And so I put it to you that one cannot be allowed to undermine the other. And there are many, many ways in which we can balance both. I do not believe that one has to be at the risk of the other. Guy makes lots of very good points. And, he's a farmer. Well, I was a farmer too, actually, a long time ago. My father was a farmer, little tiny farm in Northern Ireland, and not sustainable, actually. Too small to be sustainable. So I know the reasons why farmers feel passionate about their land and want to be able to farm for the future. But you know what? There is no getting away, even though, and I love that list of all the birds on Guy's land, but there's no getting away from the fact, and we know this, that our farm birds have declined by over 60% since 1970. We know that the quality of our soil, the degradation of our soil, is costing this nation 1.2 billion a year. We know that soil compaction costs you every year to have to till and retill and retill. We know that the energy that is going into that is because we have tilled the land too much. So even though I have no doubt that many of you are probably day and daily engaged in lots of nature conservation kinds of activities, should it be agri schemes through to some of the really great wildlife habitat restoration that many of you are doing, it's not enough. Our nature is in decline. And we are responsible for that. I know farmers don't want to hear that. I know I very often hear you're the guardians of the countryside, and you are. And so is the National Trust. We look after 250,000 hectares of land across the country. We have 1,500 tenant farmers that help us look after the environment. We're in this together, but we're not doing enough. If the slide continues, and I know many of you will roll your eyes, but we know or at least we're told that the data will tell us that we may only have 60 harvests ahead of us before the land is so degraded that it can produce no more. Now, you might not believe that, but are you going to risk it? Are you seriously going to risk it? Or do you really know that you need to invest in those public goods to ensure that you can be profitable for the future? The Trust and many of the other environmental organisations believes that there are many, many ways to do that, and we support Mr. Gove's view that you should be rewarded for investing in those public goods. We are engaged in lots of activities around the country working with farmers who want to work with us on how they do improve their soil, how they do improve their habitats, how they can improve pollinators in their land. And they're rewarded for doing that. Lots of schemes around the country that we're proving that it can be done and it can be scaled. So it's not a case of it isn't possible. It is possible, but it does require effort. And this thing about you can't be in the green if you're not in the black, you can be both. It takes more effort, it takes more focus, and it definitely takes us to be joined up. But you can do both. And I think the last thing I need to say is, frankly, if we don't, the Treasury have so many other competing arguments in their heads at the moment. They've got the NHS, there's the police service, you name it, they're under such pressure. Surely it is so obvious that the taxpayer needs to be convinced that we, the farming community, and I say we because the Trust are major farmers, we have a responsibility to prove that we will add value to the taxpayer's purse, that we will invest in public goods and the things that matter to them. Because we are coming out of camp, Brexit is ahead, we have to waken up and realise that that is the implication of what we're all going to have to deal with. And if we don't invest in those public goods, frankly, none of us will be profitable. And for that reason, I would ask the room to oppose this motion tonight. Thank you.
I thank the honourable guests for their speech. I'd now like to open the debate to the floor. If you would like to speak, please raise your hand. Speeches should be kept short and to the point, lasting no more than 2 minutes. I look for a speaker in proposition of the motion. I recognise the gentleman over here.
Right, well, one man's good is another man's evil. And let's look at some of the goods we as farmers are expected to produce. We're going to have to reduce CO2 levels, apparently. That's a good. Well, is it? Because in order to do that, we are going to have to go to GM crops and glyphosate. We can reduce CO2 if we can do that. Oh, say the Green Lobby, you mustn't do that. We hate GM crops and glyphosate even more than we hate CO2. So you're going to make enemies there. What's another good that we can do? Reduce our methane emissions from our ruminants. Yes, we can do that. If we don't feed them grass and hay and silage, if we bring them into a shed and feed them concentrates and cereals, they will produce less methane per dry matter of kg or food, whatever you call it. Oh no, say the animal rights lobby, you can't do that. You mustn't put animals in a shed. Unspeakable barbarities and mutilations and cruelty. We like to see these animals outside grazing, so you're going to make no friends there. What's another public good that we can do as farmers? We can reduce our nitrous oxide emissions. How are we going to do that? By growing less leguminous crops, the peas and the beans and the clover and the lucerne. Oh, say the Green Lobby, but we like leguminous crops because the filthy, stinking, rich capitalist pigs don't make profit out of the fertilizer you would have used if you didn't grow leguminous crops. So you're not going to make any friends there either. Not much good done. But the farmer himself, he can produce some nitrous oxide, he can do his public good. Occasionally he gets amorous around his wife and his lower body changes shape, you may have noticed. In order for that to happen, he first has to produce some nitrous oxide. So chaps, if you really want to save this planet, it's not just a question of not doing any sex, you mustn't even think about it, grow food for profit instead. Thank you.
For their speech. I now look for a speaker in opposition of the motion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My lords, ladies and gentlemen. Now, the thing about my distinguished friend from Essex is that, well, he's from Essex. And no, Essex has many strengths, like, well, I'm sure Essex has its strengths, but thinking outside the box isn't generally one of them. And let me ask you, Guy fell into this trap immediately. When you think about profitability in farming, you think about food. Indeed, it's the stick that we beat governments around the head with. You know, you've got to support farming because we all need food. Well, as we heard today, you don't necessarily need a farm to actually produce food. And I'll go a step further. The whole way we put energy into our bodies is incredibly resource intensive. This whole thing of growing plants to harvest them and process them to feed ourselves, or even worse, to feed animals to feed ourselves, it's ridiculously convoluted. The only reason we do it is because we've done it that way for tens of thousands of years. If you reinvented how we transfer energy into our bodies, you'd do it completely differently. Just look at photosynthesis, for example. The process of transferring energy into plants is only around 6% efficient. Yet we have photovoltaic systems 4 or 5 times more efficient and improving all the time. So perhaps in the energy in the future we won't need food. We'll just smear ourselves in something that will put sun's energy straight into our body. Food will become a luxury, a frippery, as much a human need as designer goods today. Then where does farming feature? So we should focus first on public goods, because that is what the public will always want. I mean, it may mean some restructuring the business, in which case you'd probably need a good lawyer, and an accountant, and no doubt a land agent as well to help you. But if you focus only on profits, you will lose the bigger picture. So I entreat you to go through the no door. Thank you.
Honourable guests for their speech. I look for the next speaker in proposition of the motion. I recognise the gentleman on the second row.
Thank you. Going to keep this short and sweet, really. I already deliver public goods on my farm. It's a contract with the government where it states the delivery of public goods. And everything down on there, and the rest of the profitability of the farm has to subsidise that public good. And it's going to be very important going forward in the future that we are going to be profitable so that we can focus on our public goods. Thank you.
I thank the honourable guest for his speech. I now look for the next speaker in opposition of the motion. Gentleman Lancaster.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to congratulate the main proposer of this motion for his passionate and articulate speech. He is actually a very modest man, but as Churchill would have said, given the logic behind his argument, he has a lot to be modest about. I have a fundamental problem, as do many people here, with the concept that farmers will only worry about the environment once they are profitable, which, as was articulated, you can't go green unless you're in the red. I would argue that the natural environment, the natural capital which is enshrined within it, and the public goods which it delivers are the basic bedrock of profitable farming, be it healthy soils, clean water, biodiversity, genetic diversity from which we will wish to draw in the future. And then there's the money and the public. So such things as landscape, public access may not be a direct benefit to farming businesses, but they will engender public support for the future money, which Treasury will have under its grasp. It won't be a ring-fenced European budget. So it was at this point I was wishing to propose an amendment to the motion, but I quickly read the Oxford Union debating rules, or 251 pages of it, and clause 44 says I have to give 3 days' notice. You might find it surprising, Guy, that I could read 251 pages in such a short time, but I can assure you it's considerably shorter than the Countryside Stewardship Manual, a document with which I'm very familiar. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would encourage you to oppose this motion, not because farmers shouldn't be profitable, but by supporting this motion, we will continue the divisive approach to either the environment or profitable farming, which in the long run will not engender the public support we will need to secure the money so that British agriculture can continue to be profitable. Thank you.
I look for the next speaker in the proposition of the motion.
Thank you, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to speak in support of my former neighbour across the Thames Estuary. I used to look across the Thames Estuary at Guy and wonder at all that rain that Essex had that never made it to Kent. I've had a very fortunate career in agriculture, and thinking about it the other day, I realised there were sort of a few correlations, perhaps not causations, but I've headed south for most of my career. I started in the north of Scotland, came to Kent, went southeast to the Kishal Fault and the Vojvodina in Central Europe, and then ended up in New Zealand for the last 6 years, which is a real privilege to farm in New Zealand. And I realised that the subsidy quantity of total income declined as I headed south. It was most of total income in the north of Scotland, and it's none of income in New Zealand. And the reverse was true of profitability. Profitability was wafer thin in the Highlands of Scotland. It was marginally better in Kent, a little bit better in Central Europe, and meaningful in New Zealand, where you generate a meaningful return on capital and a meaningful, a meaningful investment. Without profitability, and I agree completely with Guy, without profitability, there is just an awful lot that we can't do. And I'm afraid I'm going to probably disagree with Guy, because I think subsidies are a big problem for the industry. And I converted to that rather late in life, coming to New Zealand. But without profit, and profit makes farming so much more meaningful and worthwhile and allows you to achieve a lot more. So I would urge you to support Guy.
I thank the honourable guests for their speech. I now look for a final speaker in opposition of the motion. Gentleman on the second row.
I would argue that the motion is too black and white to agree directly. The motion states this House believes that the country would be better served by focus on profits, not public goods. I would argue that farmers benefit from focus on profits, the public benefit from focus on public goods, but the country benefits from efficiency of production, a balance of profit and provision of public goods, a sustainable farming business model that incorporates active provisions of public goods. And therefore the simple answer is no, the country would not be better served by focus on profits specifically.
Thank the honourable guests for their speech, and thank you to everyone who has given a floor speech in the initial round of speeches. I now look to the consultant and mixed farmer, Sarah Bell, to continue the case for the proposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would argue that if we as farmers only focus on public goods, we are calling into question our merit as anything more than park keepers. And it is my belief that this country does not wish to see farmers as park keepers and civil servants, reliant on the public purse for our income and the long-term sustainability of our future. I would draw your attention to the rail operators in this country. They take $3.2 billion a year in public subsidies. A very familiar number to most of us. Unfortunately, they find themselves in an uncomfortable position. A rail timetable in this country often only serves to tell you if you're entitled to a refund. In reality, they find themselves in an awkward situation. They are bound by an infrastructure controlled by government. Their profits are capped and short-termism is king. Where we as an industry must be terribly careful is being careful what we wish for. We would not wish to find ourselves both universally disliked and creating a gap between aspiration and the potential of delivery for the public. I could paint you a picture whereby this country became only 30% self-sufficient in food, as it is sidelined in favour of public goods. Last year, Mother Nature sent us 3 shocks: drought, which felt eternal, wet, which also felt eternal, and cold, similarly, it felt eternal at the time. And where we would be in a world where we were only 30% self-sufficient in food is we would have continual interruptions to our food supply. This, in principle, doesn't seem a terrible thing because you can always import it. Well, what if you can't import it? What if, as a UK Prime Minister, you had to decide whether you took your tea with Trump or Putin for this country to have its daily bread? Ultimately, that daily bread would always be accompanied by bitter medicine. Whilst a public goods model for agriculture might feel like a park-keeping land of milk and honey in the short term, government promises us less red tape. Where we go after public money, we will have red tape. That is the deal. This government also promised us £350 million a week for the NHS post-Brexit. I would suggest I'm more likely to farm unicorns profitably than see either of those things delivered in a hurry. So the solution for our industry must be profitability, independence, and dynamism. As Guy rightly says, our share of the food pound is not what it should be. However, nobody is going to give us a share of the food pound unless we go to them with a strategy. And that strategy cannot come from Westminster alone. We, as individuals and a collective, must have a reason to command that money, and that support for that matter. So we must take a proven strategy and develop brands. What we have heard today is of the value of speaking to the consumer. And whilst this audience might like to convert the consumer one individual at a time and educate them, and some would start with the vegetarians, I know, what we must do is go and build our brands, whether they be big brands that supply year-round produce to the market with all of the quality and integrity our consumers expect, or whether they be smaller, more specialised brands pandering to consumer aspiration, health needs, or even environmental requirements. I have no problem with farming in a treading lightly way and responding to the environmental needs I see around me. I take issue with the fact farmers can be short-termist in their views. I believe that public goods are the foundation of my business. But what I also want to see is a business that is profitable and vibrant. I want my children to be able to look at the law, agriculture, and engineering on the same plane. And I want to be able to offer them a career that is viable. And to do that, I must have a business that is profitable, and profitable in the long term. My parents' generation did not take everything they wanted out of the land. They made sure they put back, and I intend to do the same. However, we must also look to a digital future, and owning our data and the data we generate through precision farming, through the understanding of our impact as we farm, will be the route that gives us profitability. But as an industry, we must be very clear what we want from that. Because if we want a free model for data and data processing and to give us the answers to make our businesses profitable and take them forwards, we must have a vision of what we need to know and how that will drive profitability. And where we go to the supply chain with transparency, with honesty, with integrity, and we can speak to the consumer and add value, that is where we will increase our share of the food pound. We are ultimately accountable to our public, and we must make sure that our brand weighs their buying decisions in our favour every time. Those who seek to demonise the industry only succeed where we are divided. Where we own the dialogue and take the ground, we profit. So I say to you, the status quo is gone. If you are focused, ambitious, and innovative, step forward and support this motion, for you are the future of our industry.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to the Oxford Ecosystem Service Provider Conference for the invitation to speak. Now, I'm not going to argue that profit shouldn't be a central focus of all farm businesses. Of course it should, rather. In fact, I was sweating a bit when I was agreeing with what Guy was saying earlier. Instead, I want to suggest that the premise behind this motion is too narrow and too unimaginative. This motion fails to recognise the breadth of the role that farmers play within society and fails to look at the public goods that farmers provide. The public looks at you not just as food producers, the public looks to you as view creators, as carbon storers, as flood risk managers, as wildlife stewards, and much else besides. And as much as the food you produce, it is these roles which make you the centre of British life. To accept this motion would therefore, to me, deny much of what makes farming so unique as an industry and so special as a vocation. And in fact, I would also argue that it is a false choice to have to choose between profit and public goods. Many farmers in this room will know much better than me that you can farm for both public goods and for profit, and many of you will be doing so as well. In fact, many arable farmers I speak to, and it sounds like you are one of them, Guy, farming for both profit and the public good intuitively makes sense. Squaring off fields reduces inputs, you can take the lowest yielding areas out of production, you can remove drill and spray overlaps, and you can improve the efficiency of production more generally. This obviously makes space to establish wildflower margins and pollen and nectar mixes that in turn create habitats for pollinators and crop pest predators. And the evidence is increasingly emerging that this has direct benefits for food production and for your bottom line. So one recent 6-year study found that putting 8% of your arable area into wildflower margins had such impacts on these beneficial insects that there was no net loss of yield for wheat and barley and a 25% increase for field beans. For the horticulturalists amongst you, a recent AHDB-funded, industry-funded study working with one of the biggest courgette growers in the country found that putting in wildflower margins led to a 39% increase in yield, which would, if that had been applied to the entire courgette crop for 2017, would have added 3.6 million to the profit the industry had in that year. And those services, so the bumblebees that were doing all of that pollination work, were valued at £3,400 per hectare. And there was no difference between a hand-pollinated plant or a bumblebee pollinated plant. So there you go. Wildflower margins solving your, improving your bottom line, improving your yield, and solving your post-Brexit labour shortages. And for livestock farmers, especially those in the uplands in marginal areas like them, many of those who we work with have rejected the high input, high output model of agriculture, which sees them working 80 hours a week just to lose money. And instead they've embraced an extensive low input model which reduces their costs, improves their bottom line, restores the natural environment, and creates a better work-life balance. And all of those examples improve profitability whilst delivering public goods before agri-environment support, which can further enhance the profitability if you can wrestle any of that money out of the cold, dead hands of the RPA. So to me, the bottom line is that many farmers in the room are leading the way in terms of demonstrating that the best way to go green is to get into the back is to go green. And when thinking about the future of public support, public goods also present the best investment case to the Treasury. Yes, farmers are first and foremost food producers, but civil servants and politicians who I speak to day in, day out, no matter what colour the party they belong to, are completely convinced that the market should do the heavy lifting in terms of rewarding your role as food producers. Looking to the taxpayer to guarantee a profit with no added value beyond the food that the public pays for at the till is not a long-term strategy for a successful industry. For public goods though, and this is ironic because Guy mentioned he looked like a gangster in the coat that he was wearing earlier, you operate a cartel of which Al Capone would be envious. You have all of the land. Governments across the UK need you to deliver a whole range of policy objectives which we collectively describe as public goods. And the public intuitively understand that to have a countryside rich in wildlife, they need to support farmers, and they're happy to support farmers through their taxes. So in public goods, you have a golden goose that any other industry would be desperate to have. If you walk through the door, whichever door it is, to support this motion this afternoon, you might as well take your shotgun through there with you and blow your foot off on the other side. Although, I hope none of you have a shotgun, because I might not get out of here alive. By voting for this motion, you're denying yourself a cash cow that's there for the taking. So I urge you then, do not sell this proud industry short. We need a new model of farming that embraces both public goods and profit, and recognises the breadth of the farmer's role in modern Britain today. If the theme of this conference is a world of opportunity, the public goods agenda represents one of the best opportunities this industry has had for a generation to renew itself for the next generation. So I urge you, embrace this opportunity and vote against this motion tonight. Thank you.
For their speech. I would now like to reopen the debate to the floor. Again, if you would like to speak, please raise your hand. Speeches should be kept short and to the point, lasting no more than 2 minutes. I look for a speaker in proposition of the motion. The gentleman on the front row.
Mr. President, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, there is one consequence of not supporting the motion tonight, which is of such unimaginable terror and horror that I can barely bring myself to articulate it. And that is that if farmers don't make a profit, they won't be able to pay lawyers, agents, or accountants. And you will find hordes of disaffected, unemployed lawyers, agents, and accountants walking zombie-like through your farms and over our beautiful countryside. And I put it to the House that there can be no greater contamination of our countryside than that.
I now look for a speaker in opposition of the motion.
Shout. As a young person, and unlike the member for North East Norfolk, I think it is, Stuart, I still enjoy both profit and sex. I remember that at this conference, under the leadership of an extremely enlightened chairman back in 2013, produced a brilliant report which looked at the value of farming to wider society, which concluded that the provision of what we now recognise as public goods and the creation of food while making a profit are not mutually exclusive. They are one and the same thing. The proposition is nonsense. The loss of the food pound may well be a function of our broken supply chain, but how society values food is the real issue. And if we can get this wrapped up, Mr. President, and we can get to supper, which is really the important point, I have to say, sponsored by 3 of the most excellent and enlightened professional firms I can possibly think of, I, for one, see society's willingness to pay me as a farmer for public goods as simply another profit opportunity. I strongly urge you to reject the motion.
Thank the honourable guest for their speech. I look for the next speaker in proposition of the motion. The gentleman on the front row.
We all know Guy Smith, he's the Messiah. Or is he just a very naughty boy? Both. Michael Palin tread these boards many years ago, and then he went on to work out what comedy was all about. And he said, what did the Romans do for us? Well, what do farmers do for us? I am not a farmer, I am just a mere parasite on the industry. I respect the farmers for what they do. They produce good water. The hills of Scotland are much wetter than Guy's slowly dry desert he always tells about. We keep that water clean. We keep our landscapes full of tourists. We keep our carbon locked up in our forests. We are land managers and we deliver so much, as did the Romans. I don't want a 10-foot mahogany statue of Guy Smith anywhere, but I do agree with his Lorna colleague. The RSPB take £1.9 million plus of cap subsidy for delivering farming and public good. But without that, I'm sure that they would take a different view on farming. We must be profitable so we can choose to do what we want to do. But we must also, in a life of Brian Wayne, think about how we get the message over. So I suggest that our learned chairman should go out and should write in 10-foot letters 100 times across one of the great properties of Oxford that farmers must be profitable before they can deliver public goods as well as producing food. So I don't like agreeing with Guy Smith, but I do want to go through the same door as him this evening.
Thank you, honourable guests, for their speech. I now look for a final speaker in opposition of the motion. Gentleman on the front row, thank you.
Thank you very much. As a farmer's son and a student at this university, I observe that we're facing a crisis in public opinion surrounding farmers. You see this portrayal of conflict between farmers and the people who we need to buy our food, with farmers often, this sentiment that the public are anti-farming or opposed to what we're doing, where we see betrayals by vocal proponents in the press, figures like perhaps George Monbiot, Chris Packham, perceived to be vilifying farmers and their practices. And we see that it's becoming increasingly hard to make profits, with many admirable cases of individuals doing so, but often farmers still struggling to meet ends meet. And we see the public coming out and saying that we will pay farmers to do these things. Farmers, we describe ourselves as stewards of the countryside, but actually, if polled, how many of the public would that be their go-to opinion? I want farming in the UK to be profitable, but I also recognise that the public are becoming increasingly aware that they can choose what they pay farmers to do or not to do. And if they're going to pay for us to provide public goods, then that enables us to continue to crack on with what we're best at, which is providing food for this nation. Therefore, for the sake of our heritage, of our culture, of our passion, of what we're best at doing, I vote that we reject this motion. Thank you very much.
Their speech. I now look for a final speaker in proposition of the motion. Gentleman there.
Good evening. Without successful farmers, I struggle to see how public goods will be provided. For example, there are 27 million households in the UK. According to the PDSA, there are about 11 million cats. If each of those cats eats a bird a day, that's 4 billion birds lost every year. The public, therefore, can't be trusted to deliver public goods. I propose that we accept this motion.
And thank you to everyone who has given a floor speech this evening. And now look to Hilary McGrady again to close the case for the opposition.
a strange thing, I guess, that we're in a debate where we are, it seems to be, almost violently in agreement on many things. None of our speakers have actually disagreed that public goods are indeed critical, both to your success as farmers and to this nation. All of our speakers have also said that you need to be profitable. Of course you do. That seems obvious. You need to be a profitable, thriving sector in order to be able to deliver on those promises of public goods. I guess the question that we're asking ourselves is, does one have to be at the expense of the other? I really don't think it does, and several speakers have said this argument isn't of itself right, because one cannot be separated. It's almost like saying you can have an omelette without thinking about where the eggs come from. It seems nonsense in many ways. And Tom put it really eloquently, that you are in fact the people that the nation are looking to look after our land, to make sure that we do have food. You are the leaders, and you can set an agenda that does respond to what the public is looking for, but also means that you can thrive and survive. But I put it to you that if you put profit before public goods, at the expense of public goods, there will not be a profitable farming sector for the future. And I don't believe that any of us in the room wants that. So I put it to you again, please oppose this motion today. Thank you.
Thank the honourable guests for their speech. I now look to Guy Smith again to close the case for the proposition.
Thank you. In conclusion, can I thank my seconder for her erudition? Can I thank our opponents for their well-made points? I think, Tom, for the first time in history, I'm going to agree with you that to a certain extent, this is a false dilemma. It is a device to debate something. It is not the real world. And I think we accept there is merit in both sides. But the point tonight for you is, where should the emphasis lie between the two polarized points? And we would argue passionately that first and foremost, successful farm businesses ready to meet the challenges of the future and deliver public goods, first and foremost, they must be profitable as food producers. And this conference must stand up for that statement. I would be wary of telling farmers that they should constantly chase this nebulous concept of public goods and be subject to the whims of here today, gone tomorrow politicians and the latest trendy thinking in what is a public good and what is it worth. We should make no apology, no hint of an apology for wanting to be profitable as farmers and food producers. We are not primarily ecosystem service providers or land managers. We are farmers. Let's never apologize for that fact. It is time to speak up for profitable farming. I urge you to support this motion. It is worthy of your endorsement. Thank you.
Speech and all of our speakers this evening. May I remind you all that you are voting with your feet this evening. To vote in favour of the proposition, please walk out the door marked ayes. And to vote for the opposition, please walk out to the door marked noes. The results will be read out in the bar shortly after the debate ends. Make your way over there after voting, but please remain seated until our guests have left the chamber. And with that, I remain Elliot Bromley, St Edmund Hall, and your president.
Thank you very much.
Conferring going on here amongst our eminent sponsors about the prize winners for the evening. Is there a controversy?
No, there's no controversy. We can't award it to one of our sponsors.
You're going to award it to one of yourselves? Yeah. Great. Do we have some results?
Yes, we have some results. And we have
Very
some
good.
prizes
Speaker of the Evening, Duncan.
That goes to...
Would you like to award the
Yes.
medal?
That goes to David Hill. I think it's David Hill.
Very good. Very good. And the award to the young person who made the
And I think I got his name. It's Matthew Jordan. Well done.
In a moment, our speakers and the President and his team will leave, and you will have the chance to vote by going through the aye door in support of the motion, that the country would be better served if farmers focused on profit rather than public goods, or voting against the motion. I have some figures in my pocket from an earlier vote of several hundred farmers and delegates. And when we get to dinner this evening, we'll compare the two results and see how things have shifted during the course of the debate. Once again, thank you to everybody. If you'd like to show your thanks and